Well, welcome everyone to this evening session of Renaissance Lives, today dedicated to Robert Hooke's experimental philosophy, and I'm joined by the author, Felicity Henderson, from the University of Exeter. Felicity's research focuses on the early Royal Society of London. She's currently editing the Diary of Robert Hooke, and she's working also on a project, Culture of Philosophy, about women in early modern natural philosophy. I am also very privileged to be joined by Professor John Tresch from the Warburg Institute, whose current book project is called Cosmogram: How to Do Things with Worlds, which approaches the history of natural knowledge through objects used to represent the universe. Before we start our conversation, but welcome to you both and thank you for being there. Before we start our conversation, let me briefly introduce today's main character, that is Robert Hooke, who lived between 1635 and 1703. He was an English polymath employed as Secretary of the Royal Society. He was active, if you check him out on the Wikipedia, he was active as a physicist, astronomer, geologist, meteorologist, and architect. But if you read Felicity's book, you will see that he was an insatiable experimenter, that he was also a bibliophile, meaning really an avid reader more than a book collector. His life seems absolutely fueled by the desire to know everything. His activities use instruments ranging from microscope to telescope with everything in between. So reading your excellent book, Felicity, one gets the sense that Hooke spent perhaps more time learning painting because, as you say, he began his life as an apprentice to a painter, Peter Lely. Had he spent more time learning painting and produced just a few outstanding paintings, he could have been as famous as Leonardo da Vinci, since, like him, Hooke was animated with a desire, if not what seems to be a permanent pulsion to know everything by means of observation, experimentation, and conversation. And I wonder if you could perhaps temper the enthusiasm prompted by your book. And thank you for being here.
Oh, thanks, Francois, for inviting me. Yes, I mean, the comparison between Hooke and Leonardo has been made before, actually. In fact, there's an excellent history of Hooke's work that was written several years ago now, which is called London's Leonardo. So, yeah, he's definitely has the same sort of broad desire to know about every aspect of particularly the natural world. And yeah, in terms of his art, it's really interesting. We'll probably get onto it in a bit. He does seem to have have had some skill in drafting anyway, and that was an important part of his scientific work as well. So yeah.
Yeah, and so I'll just jump in. Felicity, thanks for the book. Francois, thanks for the invitation. It's really a wonderful book, very, very enjoyable. I read it on the bus going around London, and occasionally you would mention landmarks in London, and that's part of what I think is so exciting, the way in which you plug Hooke into the city and all the different kinds of settings that he finds. So London's really a major character in the book in many ways. London after the fire, London being rebuilt, and I'm sure we'll have more to say about that. I'd like to start just by asking a little bit about the portrait of Hooke as a person. We get a lot about his projects and his ideas, and a fair bit about his character. And I think you want to challenge some of the myths that are out there. And one of those myths is that he's a very curmudgeonly person, getting into fights all the time, and that he's also someone whose role is to be off stage, setting up the work of the more visible virtuosi or the philosophers at the Royal Society. So could you say a little bit about the kind of portrait that you want to convey here? And also, speaking of painting, whether there is a portrait of Hooke, because for a long time, when you looked for a portrait of Hooke online, it was associated with a picture of von Helmont. Is there a correct one anywhere? And if not, why not?
Thanks, John. Yes, so I did want to make London really central to Hooke's life because it was, he moved there from the Isle of Wight as a fairly young teenager. and apart from a spell at Oxford, he really lived in London for the rest of his life. And you know, in the diary, occasionally he talks about going to visit architectural projects in the countryside. And you always get the impression that he's very keen to return to London and very pleased when he does return to London. So it was an important part of his life, but it was an important part of his work as well. And so I guess in terms of what I was trying to do, I see Hooke as one of these really key figures in connecting the work of the early scientific community, so the Royal Society of London in this case, to a much wider community of people who were really essential in helping to promote the work of the early modern philosophers, the experimental philosophers. So, you know, Hooke is talking to people from a huge social spectrum in London. We can see here a picture of the coffee houses he was visiting. This is an interior of a coffee house. He was visiting these places of information exchange and chatting with people about his work and getting ideas from other people as well. And so I guess one of the things that I wanted to make very clear about his scientific method was that it really depended on these kinds of conversations and experiences that he was able to have in London in a way that he wouldn't have been able to have elsewhere well, certainly not on the Isle of Wight anyway at the time. So to go back to his personality, I guess the way that I approached that in the book, which to me seemed like a new approach, I guess, was to think about the way that he describes the ideal experimental philosopher. And part of that description that he makes, a very long description of what it takes to be a good experimental philosopher. And this is in some work that was published after his death, so he didn't publish this himself. But I think, you know, it reflects his intentions or his ideas. And in this work, he really focuses on the way that the person who wants to be a good experimental philosopher has to prepare themselves and has to have certain attributes and you know, certain skills. And I think, you know, from looking at the way that he conceives of this ideal experimental philosopher, that maybe we can start to see a little bit about how he sees himself, because he doesn't in his diary, you know, really talk very much about his emotions. Yes, he comes across as curmudgeonly very occasionally, I would say. You know, I think earlier scholars who portrayed him in that way were particularly focused on some of the key arguments that he had with other scholars or with other philosophers, and he did have some very you know, some yeah, quite major spats with people, but the rest of the time I think he was a pretty gregarious sort of person. And, you know, again, going back to that picture, you know, that sense of him as a member of one of these coffee house conversations, you know, you just see over and over again him going to the coffee house with a group of friends, you know, close friends, and just chatting with them really day after day. In fact, in some entries in his diary, he records going to the coffee house up to 3 times in a day. So, and I just don't think that someone who was a naturally solitary or a naturally very sort of angry or easily upset person would have these kinds of long-standing friendships and friendships that survived, you know, disagreements, as all good friendships do. And then to go on to your point about the portrait, which is a really interesting one, and I guess, you know, we all would love to have a portrait of Hooke. My opinion at the moment is that there probably never was an individual portrait of Hooke, and I'll come to what there might be in a minute. There's there's some evidence in the form of the notes made by a German visitor to London in the very late 17th century, who says that he goes to the Royal Society and he sees the portraits on the wall, and one of the best portraits was a portrait of Hooke. And so this has led people, understandably, to assume that there was a portrait of Hooke. But I think weighing against that evidence, there's a few other things. So there's no other mention of a portrait of Hooke. So his friends never mention one. What I think is quite telling is that when 2 volumes of his posthumous works were printed after his death, neither of those contained a portrait as a frontispiece, which, you know, given that he was a fairly well-respected person at the time and that the Royal Society was funding these very large volumes, which, you know, were intended to act as a kind of memorial to Hooke, I think they would have included a portrait if there had have been one. And another tiny piece of evidence, one of his friends who looked on Hooke as a patron, really, the surgeon James Young of Plymouth, comes up to London to become a fellow of the Royal Society, and he also in his diary records the portraits in the Royal Society, but he doesn't mention a portrait of Hooke, and he certainly would have mentioned one if there had have been one there, because Hooke was his patron and he was extremely, you know, fond of him. So so that's the sort of negative evidence. It has been suggested, and I completely agree that this is a possibility, that there probably is a representation of Hooke in a very large, very, very large mural that's on the wall at Christ's Hospital School. This was painted by Verrio, Antonio Verrio. And it depicts the scholars of Christ's Hospital School and some of the staff being presented to James II. And it's been suggested that Hooke is probably represented among the people in this picture, but you know, there's so many people in it that it's very hard to know which of those might be Hooke. But you know, he's probably there.
So we can keep hoping that one might turn up at some point, but you don't give us too much hope. The picture is fantastic of the coffee house, and I do think it's, from your account, really illustrative of who he is, that he's there regularly. I mean, maybe he has a coffee problem to an extent, but he certainly has a coffee house addiction. And he really, the character that seems clearest is, or character trait, is his impatience. If he hears someone's just come back from China, he'll grab him and put him in the corner and say, "Tell me everything you know." Or if someone's an expert in some kind of trade, some kind of construction, he'll grab him and just ask him to explain, how do you make the things that you make? And I think the history of the trades is one of the things that's very interesting in your story, that this is something that the Royal Society sets out as a project to try to understand different trades, and that Hooke's really at the vanguard of. So in addition to going to coffee houses, you've got him going to laboratories, to workshops, to the places where people do work. And so he's not simply gregarious. He comes across as someone who's really expert at talking to people of all kinds and getting to know what they know, really getting to understand what they understand. And could you say a little more about both how that works as a kind of a character trait of his, but also how it works as his theory of knowledge, as part of his theory of knowledge, because it seems to be really central to what he's up to.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's central to what he's up to. So the what's known as the History of Trades program was a sort of strand of research that the early Royal Society was keen to follow, and did manage to collect quite a lot of descriptions of different trade practices. They were often presented to the fellows at Royal Society meetings, but as you can see here, Hooke presented his as a written report along with this image here. And the idea was that by collecting these practices, that they would potentially be able to be improved upon, perhaps, or that the processes that were being used in one trade would be able to be transferred to a different trade. So it was just a process of collecting information. But yeah, as you say, you know, Hooke must have been able to talk to people in a way that would convince them that they should invite him into their workshops. And what's more important, I think, is that they must have trusted him with their trade secrets, because as you can see here from his diagram, you know, he's really cataloguing and describing every single aspect of the process that these felt hat makers were going through. And I don't think that's exactly what their workshop would have looked like. I think he's gathered together a whole lot of different processes, which he must have observed over the course of a day or more than one day. So you know, going back to talk to these people. And if you look at the sort of picture of the hand there, which you can see on the screen, figure 4, he's actually interested in the sort of special cuff that the operators of some of the tools had to wear in order to stop their clothing being caught in the processes that they were doing. So he's interested in absolutely every aspect of the trade, including parts that some of his colleagues would have felt were a little bit perhaps beneath them, a bit dirty. So one of the materials that was used was urine as part of the processing of the felt. And so Hooke was one of the fellows who really took seriously the need to go into places that gentlemen wouldn't necessarily normally go into, or wouldn't be welcomed into, and talk to people who they wouldn't necessarily be talking to. And he obviously had a skill for it, and not all of his colleagues were willing or able to do that. And I do think that it formed an important part of his philosophical method. You know, he really felt that collecting as much information as possible about the natural world and the materials and the processes that people were using would add to his knowledge, and would then enable him to extrapolate from that to other processes, and you know, to sort of other uses for the materials. So yeah, he was a real Baconian in the sense that he was dedicated to, I think, to sort of the collecting of information as a first step towards the expanding of knowledge.
And that's information about how things are made, what are the processes of construction. And there's a really interesting way in which he seems to be as interested in what humans do to make things as he is in natural processes and how they're made. And there's a kind of analogy between them, but he also, at one point, you say, well, just because humans have found a way to simulate something that seems to resemble something in nature, that's important to understand how they did it. What are the processes? How do the different parts fit together? What are the causal patterns and what are the physical structures? That doesn't mean that it's identical. So in what ways is it similar and in what ways is it different? So everything, human production and natural production, has a kind of root or a method to it that you need to learn to follow from start to finish. And then you begin to compare, and you also begin to combine and mix them. So there's really not a very strong divide between the natural and the artificial, and the given and the mechanical. Does that sound right to you?
Yes, yeah. I mean, yeah, exactly. So, and as we're looking at the pictures from Microscopy now, I think that sort of sense that everything in the world depends on similar sort of mechanisms and similar processes stemmed in a large part from his microscopy, which was something that he did quite, I guess, quite early in his career. So he published the Microscopy in 1665. So he was just 30 when he published that. And as you can see here from these two images, you know, the one on the right I often ask audiences to guess what these things are, but I'm not going to do that now. So at the top there, you have the tip of a needle. The blobby sort of furry thing is a printed full stop. Yeah, and then below it is the edge of a razor. And this is the second image in Microscopy. So it comes immediately after Hooke's depiction of his microscope, so his tools. And the point of this image is solely to show people that the world as they know it is not the world as it actually is. So he's literally saying to people, look, what you think is sharp and straight is not. It's pitted and blunt. And this tiny printed full stop is actually, he calls it like a splatch of London mud. And so, you know, his point here is that the things of the natural world, the more you, the things of the man-made of the human world, the more you look at them, the less neat and the less perfect they appear, and the more degraded they look. Whereas the things of the natural world, the closer you look at them, the more perfect they appear. And so you can see here from, this is an image of a louse holding a human hair. And you can see the tiny hairs, or I don't know if that's the correct name for them, on the louse's head and throughout the body, are really sort of perfectly sharp. And Hooke just says, you know, the closer you look at the things of the natural world, the more perfect they appear. And when he's looking at them, he's constantly thinking about the mechanisms that he can see there, and thinking about whether those mechanisms have some kind of analogy with mechanism, or, you know, with machines that he's seen in the human world. So he's thinking about these possible connections between the micro world and the world that we live in. Partly, you know, in order to think about the causes of things and natural processes, and partly, I think, through a desire to, you know, to help people, really, to, as Bacon said, science shouldn't just be about experiments of light. It should be about, you know, changing the human condition as well. So not just producing knowledge, but producing fruit. And, you know, one of the things he does when he's looking at, for example, the nettle in Micrographia, and thinking about the way that the spikes on the nettle, he can see them injecting a liquid into his skin, and so he attributes the burning sensation to the fact that the nettle needles are injecting this poison under his skin. And he says, well, maybe, you know, if we were able to inject medicines into the body, then that would be a more effective way of treating things. And so he's sort of constantly thinking about whether these mechanisms might suggest a different way of doing things in human society.
Yeah, that's really great. And I want to ask more about his kind of thoroughgoing mechanism, but there's also the way in which, you know, for Bacon, it can be for use, but it's also a form of worship to study nature, to appreciate the glory of the creation. And that's very important for a lot of other natural philosophers at the time. It doesn't seem quite so much of a theme, the kind of natural theological aspect, to look in the works of the world and use that as a kind of jumping off point for acknowledging the greatness and omnipotence and knowledge of God and benevolence of God. It doesn't seem quite such a major theme for Hooke. Can you say a little bit about where natural theology plays a role in his work? And also, you say he's the son of a minister in the Isle of Wight, although he fled from the Isle of Wight very early. What role religion might play in his life in this post-Civil War era, where people have really been battling it out over the proper faith and the proper way of administering the sacraments?
Yeah, no, that's a really interesting question. I wish the surviving records said a little bit more about Hooke's religious life, but it's very hard to gauge from what we have. So in the Micrographia, he does he puts in the fairly standard references to God. In this creature we can see the works of the Creator in their glory and that kind of thing. Which I think he probably broadly believed, but in terms of his own personal faith, it's very hard to gauge what that was. His early biographer, Richard Waller, who published the first posthumous works of Hooke, said that Hooke was a frequent studier of the Bible in its original languages, and points out that in his diary he does often sort of refer to God at points of anger or of joy. So he gives thanks to God for for things occasionally. Again, in a perhaps in a slightly mechanical way, but he doesn't record going to church very frequently. And Waller also makes this very odd comment. He says that if Hooke was particular in some matters, let us leave him to the searcher of hearts. So it does hint that Hooke was quite a free thinker, and he associates with a group of people who do have some rather unorthodox ideas. So his friend Francis Lodwick was firmly believed in pre-Adamites and owned a lot of Socinian tracts, and Hooke seems to be given a Socinian tract by Thomas Firmin, who was an anti-Trinitarian. So I think we could probably say that he valued tolerance, and he valued liberty of conscience, and I think that's perhaps as far as we can really go with his religion.
Yeah, fair enough. Sorry, François.
No, but so we cannot say that he was an atheist undercover, or at least we cannot know. It's something we just cannot know.
No, I wouldn't go so far as to call him an atheist. And he was very, very close to very religious people, Boyle in particular, but also John Wilkins, his early mentor, who was Bishop of Chester, John Tillotson, who was Archbishop of Canterbury. So he lived amongst some extremely devout people.
So you do mention Boyle, and he worked closely with Boyle for many years. He administered experiments for him, and worked at the Royal Society with him, or helped administer the experiments with the famous air pump. And Boyle, as you mentioned, is pretty explicit about his Christian beliefs and the way in which the natural philosophy that he's putting forward, including a mechanical philosophy, is totally congruent with Christian metaphysics and faith. And I think a lot of people who are looking at the 17th century Royal Society these days and trying to understand the experimental philosophy and the mechanical philosophy are coming to the conclusion that the mechanical philosophy was never really quite as pure as people have said it was, because you've got Boyle invoking God, you've got him constantly, you've got him being interested in alchemy. There are lots of spirits that seem a little bit unsteady as to how material they might be in his work. Likewise, Newton, famously very engaged in alchemy, gods all over his system of the world, or someone like Digby, who's Catholic and drawing on Gassendi, whose mechanics is not really the simple reductive mechanics. So there's a lot more going on in mechanism than we've thought. But what strikes me about Hooke, this person who you say before he makes any explanation or any description, starts talking about the instruments, starts talking about the machines you use to know it. In your presentation, Hooke comes across as perhaps the purest mechanist that's out there. There are machines at every level of reality. Every natural process, and of course every human process, can be understood in terms of efficient causality, gears within gears, elements bouncing off of other elements. Teleology is not part of the argument. It's physical things interacting. that goes as far as his understanding of the mind and thought. There's a purely mechanical understanding of how the brain works in this very curious essay that you unpack. Does that seem true to you, that he's like a thoroughgoing mechanist in a way that even the kind of classic philosophers of the mechanical philosophy turn out not to be?
Yeah, so I mean that's definitely my vision of Hooke, and I haven't really come across anything to you know, to make me question that view of his mechanism. I think, as you know, for everything that you read of his work, really, it always comes back to mechanism. And yeah, in terms of the air pump there, which I put in as an illustration of his early collaborations with Boyle. You know, I think he and Boyle obviously shared a lot, and you know, he talks about, or Boyle as well talks about, the way that they work together on various things, and Boyle continues to be a really important person in Hooke's life, you know, throughout Boyle's own life. He dies in the 1690s. But you know, in certain areas they don't, I think, see completely eye to eye. And alchemy seems to be one thing that Hooke isn't particularly interested in. He's certainly involved in circles who talk about that kind of thing, but he seems not to really respond when people ask him questions about that. In terms of, yeah, the theory of the theory of memory, or the theory of how the brain works, I just find this a really fascinating very short lecture that comes in the middle of his lectures on light, or towards the end of them. So he's you know, written this very long running series of lectures about the properties of light. And he sort of takes time out from that, I think prompted by by thinking about how time works, and he's interested in why humans can perceive some things and not other things, and obviously, you know, they can see some things and not others. And he starts to think about the memory as an organ for recording time, basically. So he thinks that you know, we understand the passage of time through the accretion of new memories, and so it's kind of this organ that records time, basically. And then he carries on with this thought, and I think it's a little bit gets quite interested in the idea. And so he posits that the brain is constantly producing tiny microscopic particles of matter that record sense information. So, you know, we experience the world through our senses, as all his colleagues would have agreed. But that for him, these sense impressions are stamped on, or somehow mold these tiny particles, which are produced in the brain and sort of spiral out from a center of production in the brain. And so they're physical things. And the distance between the center of the spiral and the outer end of the spiral is how you calculate, you know, how the brain understands the passage of time. But then he goes on to think about how memories combine to form new ideas. And so he says that, like all matter, these memory particles vibrate, and some of them are vibrating in unison. And that the ones that vibrate in unison sort of set up a harmony with each other, because they contain elements, they share elements of similar things. And that those particles come together to form a new idea, because they're sort of vibrating in harmony. And other particles that don't share similarities, you know, vibrate differently, and so they don't form part of this idea. And watching over all this activity is the soul. And the soul can sort of animate different memories by its influence. But memories can also attract the attention of the soul by vibrating in harmony. There's a picture of the brain from the work of Thomas Willis, who Hooke was helping in Oxford. This is an illustration that was done by Christopher Wren. And so Hooke's theory of how the mind works is itself mechanical. It's all mechanical until you get to the soul. And obviously at the point that he gets to the soul, he has to stop, really, because there's a note in the printed version of the lecture, and that there's also a note in the minutes of the meeting where he's talking, about these ideas, and his colleagues are saying, hang on, if you're making the soul part of this mechanical world, it seems that it's no longer spiritual, and that's a problem for them, obviously. So he sort of stops there and doesn't come back to it. But I think it's really telling that that the tiniest particles are still operating under the same principles as the stars and other bodies.
And that's a point you make elsewhere, that he's very quick in all of his studies of the trades and of different processes in the natural and artificial worlds to make analogies across settings, across contexts. And it made me think of the way in which the sort of late 16th century is often presented in histories of science, where it's this cosmos where it's a tissue of correspondences, of analogies, of semblances and similarities. And then that's set up as the before this big break, which is the break into mechanism, and people start looking at efficient causality and physical reality. But what you seem to be showing Hooke doing is actually continuing the process of analogism, thinking in analogical terms, but in a much more restricted way. There's only one analogy that matters, which is the analogy of mechanism. And in a way, the micrographia is precisely that. It's connecting the telescopic views of the very large and distant, those of the macrocosm, to the microcosm of the very small, the fly and the needle, the point of the needle. So in a way, mechanism is still a microcosmic and analogical way of thinking, just in an unusually narrow way, in a strikingly new and narrow way.
Yeah, I agree, and I do think it's really interesting, and it has caused some scholars to sort of suggest that Hooke, does buy into this this world where things are affected at a distance by other things. But I think you're right, and he's using analogical thinking in a very specific way, and he's basically he uses this idea all the time that by similitudes, as he calls them, we'd call them analogies or similes, you can basically argue from something that you can see and touch and understand to something that you can't necessarily ever know. So he agrees that in some cases we may not be able to physically see or understand the cause of something, but that by arguing analogically, then we can understand something about it.
And you even talk about the algebra of discovery that he comes up with. So,
yeah, so he talks a lot about his philosophical algebra. So he thinks that there should be, or that he thinks that he's discovered a way of reasoning about natural knowledge that in some way mirrors the way that algebra helps people to solve geometrical problems. And so he's basically saying that there's a sort of foolproof method of making new knowledge. And unfortunately, he never writes down what this actually is. So I think we have to question whether it was a sort of fully formed idea in his mind, or whether he really just sort of felt that this should be the case and wanted it to be the case. And different scholars have suggested different answers to this question of what the philosophical algebra was. But it seems that it probably was a method of moving from sort of the facts, the information that he was collecting, into the causes of all the things that he was witnessing, and then sort of moving back again, possibly through a kind of tabulation of the different possibilities, and then a sort of methodical elimination of different possibilities for the causes of things, and I think you can sort of see that in his emphasis on record keeping and his sort of increasing insistence that information about the natural world had to be kind of presented in a particular way so that you could see it all in one glance. And, you know, you could potentially, he says, you know, you should write down pieces of information on what we would know as post-it notes, basically, so that you could move them around on the page and take them away if necessary. And so he's constantly thinking about how to sort of organize knowledge. And I think the philosophical algebra was probably a way of moving from this sort of rather scattered, general kind of Baconian heap of information to a much more ordered system of knowledge.
Yeah, and you've got him looking at Leibniz's calculating machine. So it's really, I think, in line with everything you're saying, that he would want to come up with a kind of mechanical process for knowledge, which is maybe what the algebra was, and his way of working with notes and his note-taking practices and his record-keeping practice.
Exactly, yeah. So he definitely felt that there should be a better way of doing things. I mean, I was thinking about it the other day. I mean, he would have loved AI, and you know, you imagine him really diving into the world that we live in today, and having all these tools at his command would be amazing for him. The picture that you're looking at there is actually it's a furnace that was made to make a particular kind of light, a sort of conical cone to reflect light. But he was particularly interested in this furnace, obviously. He doesn't really, this is a picture from his diary manuscript. He doesn't really draw, this is the largest sketch that he makes in his diary. And he was obviously quite interested in the way that this furnace was constructed. So again, you know, thinking about the way that things are, the processes that are being used to do particular things.
Yeah, you give the impression, you know, talking about today, that he's less of the Steve Jobs and more of the Wozniak, is, I think, the division of labor, that he's not the one who polishes up the product and gives it to the world and takes all the credit for it. Although occasionally he gets pretty miffed if someone seems to be taking credit for something that he'd prepared. But he's much more the person who wants to figure out how it works and get it up and running, and lets other people finish it off and often reap the profits. So I'm curious about some of his debates on, as you say, these famous controversies surrounding priority, and your sense of where he saw himself in terms of really trying to get credit for what he'd come up with, and where he saw that process as having been gone wrong or manipulated against him, where someone may have worked against him. Because that is one of the places where that myth of him being quite cantankerous does seem to have some justification.
Yeah, and the other sort of thing that people say about him as well is they question his status within the Royal Society, and whether he was seen as a gentleman, because of course he was so heavily involved in mechanical activities and sort of trade practices and that kind of thing. So in terms of the priority disputes, obviously the big ones are the dispute with Huygens about the spring watch, and of course the dispute with Newton about the inverse square law and you know, for gravity. I guess, I mean, I think for Hooke probably they were more important because he was so involved with the world of trade and the world of instrument makers, and saw some of those people having to protect their priority and in inventions, and keep control of how things were made. He was obviously very hurt by the way that some of his colleagues responded to his arguments, both with Huygens, I think, and also with Newton. And that's really shown in his diary, where he falls out with one of his closest friends, but they do get back together as friends again. So it's not permanent. And yeah, in terms of what it meant for him as a person, I mean, he does come up with so many ideas over the course of his life, and he often says things in his printed works, for example, about other people taking up the hints that he's provided for them, which of course they do go on to do, but he's not particularly happy that they seemingly forget his initial contribution to the idea, and yeah, I think he just becomes a bit tired of it, I think, towards the end of his life. Some of his contemporaries, Richard Waller, again, his biographer, says that he became withdrawn, and he was less willing to share his research with people. And I think he found it annoying that that his work was sort of being overlooked, or reinvented, I guess. If he'd done something 20 years previously, and then people weren't familiar with it and were coming up with it again as a new thing.
Yeah, it's quite understandable, but you also, I think, link it to his interest in the trades. So he sees how people in the guilds and in the trades, their knowledge is crucial to their ability to make a profit, but it's not the knowledge itself that allows them to make the profit. They control it, they have a monopoly on it, but they use that knowledge to produce things that they can then sell. And he's in this, at the time, fairly ambiguous position where he's got knowledge, but not necessarily anything that he makes. He's not creating a business to make the watches or to make any of his inventions. So he seems to be a real contributor to the idea of priority as an element, establishing priority in print as an element to creating a kind of regime of intellectual property. I mean, he seems quite modern in that sense. And the fact that he's depressed that it hasn't worked shows that things haven't yet quite gotten to where they'll get to in the 19th and 20th centuries.
Yeah, and at one point he sort of suggests that he could solve the longitude problem, and goes into starts having some negotiations about how much he might be paid for this, but I can't remember the full details of it, but I think they say, well, we'll give you some money, but you wouldn't get it if someone else came up with a different plan that was better than yours. And he sort of says, well, it's very easy to improve on something that's already already been suggested to someone. So he's aware that that everything is able to be taken and manipulated and reused by someone else.
Yeah, and for a profit.
Yeah.
I think what you do seem you're not too overt about it, but you seem to be pretty reluctant to endorse the idea that Hooke is an invisible technician, to use the term of Steve Chapin, that with the broader idea that many of the members of the Royal Society are gentlemen, so you can trust them because they're not making money off of anything that they're saying. They're independently wealthy, or they have inherited wealth, which means they're not selling what they know. Whereas Hooke is in this more ambiguous, this is the way in which it's presented. He's more in the category of the mechanic, therefore less trustworthy. And first of all, you show that he actually made quite a lot of money. He was doing fine. He wasn't dependent on any of his inventions to make money through various means, but also that his class status may not have been so lowly as it's been presented, and also that many of the gentlemen that he's circulating with are also interested in making money, so that maybe it's a much more mixed environment than it's been presented with this great dichotomy between gentlemen and mechanics. Can you say more about that?
Yes, yeah, that's a good representation of my understanding of things. Yeah, I mean, Hooke is certainly not invisible. He is the colleague who always has to say something at every meeting that you go to, and maybe slightly annoying on that count. But he is the least invisible fellow of the Royal Society. And yeah, I don't really think that his status can be questioned. You know, he was the son of a gentleman. He was a gentleman. He's treated well by the other fellows of the Royal Society. After his death, his works are collected not just once but twice and published on the request of the fellows. He's given an honorary doctorate towards the end of his life. So I really don't think that we can see him in any sense as just a mechanic. And in terms of trust, it's a really complex question, obviously. But I think perhaps that sense in which it's the word of a gentleman that can be trusted. In terms of my own research, I'm interested in the way that a lot of different people contribute to the work of the early philosophical community. And so my understanding of natural philosophy may be slightly wider, but it includes a lot of people who are not gentlemen, so women, for example, and the kind of tradespeople that Hooke is talking to. And so I would like to see that that narrative sort of changed to include different people. And I think maybe the notion of credit is actually a more useful one, which is, drawn from the sort of mercantile community, a different way of trusting someone and, being able to work with them. Yeah.
If I may say, one aspect of the visibility of Hooke is Gresham College, where you explained that he lectured for a great part of his life and actually was paid much better than most university professors today. Can you comment briefly on his lectureship career, so to speak, lecturing career?
Yes, yeah. So he was in his very early appointment by the Royal Society, was bolstered by the fact that he was elected as a fellow of Gresham College. So he was the professor of geometry there. But he was also at the same time giving a series of lectures for Sir John Cutler, who was a wealthy benefactor who was part of the City of London, a very wealthy merchant. And so he was giving sort of two series of lectures at the same time in Gresham College, partly on geometry, but also the Cutlerian lectures, which were supposedly on art and science. So art being human productions, really, and science. And you can see in this image, he had rooms at Gresham College. The quadrangle, the top right-hand corner of the quadrangle there, you can see the little astronomy observation turret that he had built on top of his rooms, which had a telescope which extended down into his rooms so that he could observe things. And so meetings of the Royal Society were held at Gresham College, and Hooke lived there basically for, well, the whole of his life when he was in London. So he was really at the heart of London, physically as well as mentally, and was surrounded by other lecturers there. His lectures don't seem to have been particularly well attended, so the diary often records that no one came to his lectures, or occasionally someone came and just fell asleep and wasn't listening to him. But the boys of the Royal Mathematical School at Christ's Hospital do seem to have attended, presumably, his geometry lectures. So he did have some audiences.
That's interesting that we can see his actual house. Can you say a little bit about his domestic relations? I mean, you mentioned that he had a father who was a minister. He had a brother who committed suicide. He was very close with his niece. Did he have other close relations? How do we understand him in that way? Is it possible to reconstruct that?
Yeah, we can reconstruct it a bit from his diary. So his father died when he was, I think, 13, and that's why he moved up to London to take up this informal apprenticeship with Peter Lilly. He left that very shortly afterwards and ended up studying under Busby at Westminster School, and then went on to Oxford from there. And so he remained in touch with Busby really for the rest of his life. So he was a great mentor to him. In terms of his home life, he had a series of maids who some of whom he became quite close to, and in fact had sexual relationships with. Nell Young was the first, during the period of the diary, who left his employment fairly soon after that, but they remained in touch for the rest of Hooke's life, I think. And he would often give sort of small sewing jobs and things to Nell to do. So they were obviously on good terms. She once gave him a fetus that she'd somehow come across, but anyway.
A memorable gift, at least.
A memorable gift, yeah, but certainly something that he would have, been very pleased to have, I think. He also had a series of apprentices or helpers, the most important of whom was Henry Hunt, who became an operator for the Royal Society as well, but seems to have pretty much occupied the position of a son to Hooke. They met daily in Hooke's later life. But the person that he seems to have been closest to was Grace, his niece. So she came to live with him sort of on and off from around 1674 onwards. Around then. She was born in 1660, and by 1676 at least they were certainly having some kind of sexual relationship. It's not entirely clear exactly what that consisted of from the diary entries, but she was certainly someone who he loved and or cared for very deeply. Unfortunately, she died in 1687, which was a period that we don't have any diary records from. So we don't have Hooke's reaction to that. But his biographer, Richard Waller, suggests that that was a sort of turning point in his life, really, and that he never really recovered from her loss.
On this note, I think it's time to open the panel to questions from the audience. So I would ask you either to send me your question through the chat or to use the raise hand option, and then I will ask you to unmute and you can ask your question directly. While you're preparing your question, if I can ask you one more question, Felicity, for I really come from the Renaissance, so to speak, and when you study the Renaissance, mechanical art, it's almost a rude word, a dirty word. Every painter doesn't want to be associated with mechanical art. So do cooks and ceramists and so many people. While in the 17th century, there's clearly a change of even of paradigm, of civilization paradigm. Can you comment a little bit on the kind of change in the acceptation of the term mechanic and mechanical art from something low class to something that opens knowledge? Or that's my understanding.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I think the term is still somewhat pejorative in the period that we're talking about. But I think Hooke and others are kind of reclaiming that term. For example, Richard Waller, says that Hooke is a mechanic, but, in a very positive way, and sort of talks about the fact that Hooke is able to explain ideas to his colleagues in a really concise and clear way, and attributes that to his sort of mechanical expertise. John Aubrey, I think, calls Hooke the greatest mechanic of our times or something like that. But, you know, Aubrey was a massive fan of Hooke. And so he's not doing that to be, you know, to be nasty. And I think it's quite interesting as well that, you know, in the early biography of Newton that's written, I can't exactly remember when, but you know, just after his death, his childhood is described as being very mechanical as well. So he's making little toys, and he makes a windmill that works and has a mouse in it or something. I can't remember exactly. And so I think the term is very much changing during the period, as you suggest.
Okay. Well, I don't see any questions in the chat nor any raised hand, but perhaps John, you have something to add or some more points.
There's another aspect of the book, which is toward the end. You tell us a lot about his theories of the earth. He's without him quite being an environmental thinker, he's very concerned about its construction, about its contents, and even has a theory of earthquakes. And also the theory of fossils is very, very important. Now, these are things that obviously are touching on questions of creation, divinity, and also with fossils, questions of life. Does he have a mechanical understanding of fossils and a mechanical understanding of life? How does he think about the earth? How does he think about its formation and where it goes wrong, where catastrophe might come from?
Yes, he does think a lot about catastrophes, actually. Yeah, so he writes a lot about the earth, and in particular about the fact that it's suffered sort of catastrophic change over the course of the Earth's history. So as you can see here, he's studied fossils very closely. This is an image that he has done him, so you know he's drawn himself. So he believes that fossils are the remains of living organisms, which was, I mean, it wasn't unheard of at the time, but it was an unusual understanding of what fossils were. And he sort of goes on from that to suggest that you know, they may once have been creatures on the earth that don't exist now. So that is quite it's quite an unusual idea for the time, because obviously if God had bothered to save all the animals in the ark, then why would he let any of them die out after that? So, you know, this sense that things should remain stable. Hooke has a much more sort of you know, dynamic view of the earth. I think that it's constantly changing. So he says, you know, that the reason that these fossils are here, are found in England, because England was once covered by water, and that you know, we once stood in the torrid zone, as he called it, so the sort of the warm waters of the past. And yeah, so he muses about the earth really, you know, in a lot of detail for over many years. So these lectures seem to run, you know, sporadically from the 1680s right through to the end of his life. He becomes very interested in other ways that you can date things as well. So he's interested in other sort of artifacts as markers of you know, of the past. And he also becomes very interested in classical mythology in this sense as well. So he's looking at, in particular, the works of Ovid, and sort of combing through the stories and thinking about whether they might be, well, not coded, but I guess analogical descriptions of earthquakes or volcanoes or other things. So he, you know, he looks at the stories of the giants battling the gods, and sort of says, well, actually, this is just a way of talking about a volcano that had erupted, and it was firing things into the air, and so it seemed like giants were throwing things at the sky. So he sees, you know, he sees sort of all the evidence spread out in front of him in a very sort of holistic way.
Thank you. Now I have a few questions in the chat. So the first one is from Alan Shepard. Thank you. Very interesting. The mention of philosophical algebra brings Leibniz to mind and his vision of a language with which one could settle philosophical dispute by formulating them in this language and saying, let us calculate. Is there any influence between Leibniz and Hooke?
Yes, that's really interesting. Hooke is also involved in universal language projects in England. He's part of a group of people who carry on the work of John Wilkins, who was an early universal language theorist. And yeah, he and Leibniz had an interesting relationship. I mean, at one point, Leibniz came to the Royal Society to show the Society his calculating machine, and then wrote rather huffily afterwards to Henry Oldenburg, the secretary, that Hooke had not only inspected his machine very closely, but taken the back off it and was able to look at the mechanisms, and that someone who was, you know, so mechanically minded would have then been able to copy something that he'd looked at like that. So Leibniz was a bit concerned that Hooke was going to steal his idea, but I mean, they had lots of ideas in common, and certainly it's been suggested that the philosophical algebra was connected with the universal language project. I think it was probably slightly less linguistically constructed for Hooke. I think his universal algebra was more likely, as Hess argues, to be to do with well, perhaps the way that you arranged information. Although the universal language schemes did attempt to sort of codify and classify the relationships between things. So they're not unconnected.
Another question from Giorgio Triani this time. Thank you for your insightful presentation. Could you please elaborate further on the distinction that you previously made between credit and trust? Specifically, how do these categories differ in terms of their application in assessing reports and other kinds of testimonies?
Thanks. That's a great question. I should say that I haven't worked on this myself, but the work of Craig Muldrew is really interesting in terms of thinking about networks of credit amongst merchants in particular in the period, and the way that they have to trust each other in order to extend credit or potentially not extend credit to people. And I think that for me, that's quite a useful way of thinking about how members of the philosophical community might start to rely on for example, correspondents or people who are producing information for them, because it seems to me that that's a slightly I don't want to say more democratic, because that's not how it was, but it's I guess a credit relationship is one in which anyone could participate potentially, you know, women and foreigners as well as gentlemen. And so for me, that's a more useful way of thinking about techniques for assessing the validity of information that's passed on from someone else.
Thank you. One comment from Keith Tabor, not a question, just a comment regarding the making of model mills. Supposedly, George Stephenson made model water mills as a boy, so making model mills might have been a more common activity than we might assume in the days before television and social media. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I mean, it seems to be pretty common. And I wasn't aware of that example, but yeah, and obviously an excellent introduction to all sorts of tasks that one might need to complete as an experimental philosopher.
I don't see any more questions. I see a comment from Max Brecher, which certainly summarizes my impression too, which is extremely interesting presentation. So many interesting avenues to explore. Great, thank you so much. So I think on this note, it's really time to thank you, Felicity, John, and all of you who have participated and contributed to this session. So thank you very much, everyone, and I wish you a good evening. And we'll meet again at the end of February when we will talk about the painter, Lucas Cranach. So thank you again, and good night, everyone.